January 30, 1944, 3 o'clock in the morning. 767 American Rangers were crawling through drainage ditches in the Italian darkness. The water was waist-deep in places. The mud sucked at their boots with every step. The night was black, no moon, no stars, just the sound of 700 men breathing and the quiet splash of boots through standing water. They were moving toward a town called Cisterna, a small crossroads sitting on Highway 7, the ancient Via Appia, and they had been told the town was lightly defended. A few German outposts. Thin screening forces, nothing the Rangers could not handle. These were the most elite soldiers in the United States Army. They had trained with British commandos in the Scottish Highlands. They had stormed beaches in North Africa. They had spearheaded every major American assault in the Mediterranean theater. They had never been defeated. Not once. Not ever. In 3 hours, the sun would come up. In 3 hours, they would discover that everything they had been told was wrong. By noon, these 767 men would cease to exist. Not as a weakened unit needing replacements. They would be erased so completely that the army would disband their battalions and never rebuild them. 767 men went into those ditches. 6 came back. This is the story of the night America's most lethal fighting force walked into a trap that no one saw coming, and the colonel who had to sit in a farmhouse and listen on the radio while it swallowed them whole. His name was William Orlando Darby. He was born on February 8, 1911, in Fort Smith, Arkansas, a small town pressed against the Oklahoma border where the Arkansas River bends west. His father, Percy, owned a print shop in town and directed the local pit orchestra. His mother wanted him to be an engineer. Darby wanted to be a soldier. He applied to West Point, was accepted, and graduated in 1933, ranked 177th out of 346 cadets. He was not the brightest in his class. He was not the most polished. But rankings at West Point do not measure the thing that mattered most about William Darby. He could make men follow him into places where following seemed insane. Not because he ordered them to follow, because they believed in him so completely that refusing to follow never occurred to them. That quality cannot be taught at any military academy in the world. It cannot be faked on any battlefield. Darby had it from the day he put on the uniform. After graduation, the Army commissioned him as a second lieutenant in field artillery and assigned him to the 82nd Field Artillery Regiment at Fort Bliss, Texas. He spent the next 9 years in peacetime garrison duty, training exercises that went nowhere, paperwork that led to more paperwork, the slow, grinding routine of a professional army waiting for a war everyone could feel approaching but no one could stop. When Pearl Harbor was attacked on December 7, 1941, Darby deployed to Northern Ireland as an aide to Major General Russell Hartle, commanding the 34th Infantry Division. It was a staff job. Meetings, memos, logistics, liaison work. Darby was 31 years old. The entire world was tearing itself apart, and he was shuffling papers in Belfast while other men fought. Then the order came down from Washington that would change everything. In the spring of 1942, General George Marshall directed the creation of an American commando-style unit, modeled on the British commandos, who had been launching raids against the coast of occupied Europe. Colonel Lucian Truscott, serving as the American liaison to British Combined Operations Headquarters, suggested the name Rangers, after Major Robert Rogers and his frontier raiders from the French and Indian War in the 1750s. Someone had to build this force from scratch. From raw volunteers, from men who had never done anything like this before, the army picked Darby. It was the best decision anyone in the chain of command made during the entire Italian campaign. On June 19, 1942, the 1st Ranger Battalion was officially activated at Carrickfergus, Northern Ireland. Darby put out the call for volunteers across every American unit in the theatre. He wanted men who could march farther, fight harder, and think faster than anyone else in the army. He wanted men who would volunteer for missions that regular soldiers would refuse. 600 stepped forward. 281 came from the 34th Infantry Division, 104 from the 1st Armored Division, 43 from anti-aircraft units, 48 from 5th Corps Special Troops. The rest came from scattered units across Northern Ireland. Darby did not just take whoever showed up. He interviewed them. He tested them. He looked for something beyond physical strength and marksmanship scores. He looked for the quality that separates men who fight from men who fight and keep fighting when every rational thought says stop. He found it in 500 of the 600. He took them to Scotland, to the British Commando training depot at Achnacarry Castle in the Highlands, and turned them over to Lieutenant Colonel Charles Vaughan, the depot commandant. What followed was weeks of the most punishing military training any of them had ever imagined. Speed marches through the Scottish mountains carrying full equipment for miles without rest. Log drills in freezing streams until arms gave out and men dropped. Obstacle courses rigged with explosive charges that detonated beside the runners. Live machine gun fire overhead during crawling exercises, so close that men could feel the heat of the tracers. River crossings in the dark wearing full packs and weapons. Hand-to-hand combat until men collapsed from exhaustion and then got up and did it again. Night navigation through terrain that could break an ankle or a neck with one wrong step. Small boat operations in the icy waters of the Scottish lochs. Demolitions training with real explosives. Street fighting in purpose-built urban villages where the British fired live rounds past the Americans as they cleared rooms. One American ranger was killed during the course. Several more were wounded. The commandos did not apologize. The message was simple and brutal. If training does not scare you, combat will kill you. The men who survived Achnacarry understood that everything after Scotland would be easier. Some of them were wrong about that. Most of them were right. 500 of the 600 volunteers completed the course. 100 washed out or were injured beyond recovery. Those who remained came down from the Scottish mountains as something the American army had never produced before. Not regular infantry, not airborne, not military police. Rangers, Derby's Rangers. They were lean, aggressive, hard as the Highland granite they had trained on, and absolutely certain they could take any objective against any enemy at any odds. Before they could prove it on their own terms, 50 Rangers were attached to British and Canadian units for the raid on Dieppe, France, on August 19, 1942. Operation Jubilee was a catastrophe for the Canadians, and 3 Rangers were killed in action, making them among the first American soldiers to die in ground combat in Europe. But those who survived brought back invaluable lessons about amphibious assault against fortified coastline. Every lesson learned at Dieppe under fire would be applied in the battles to come. Then Derby let his Rangers prove what they could do alone. On November 8, 1942, the 1st Ranger Battalion made the first American Ranger assault of the war at Arzew, Algeria, during Operation Torch. 2 companies under Major Dammer stormed Fort de la Pointe. Derby personally led the remaining 4 companies against Batterie du Nord. Both coastal fortifications fell in under an hour. The harbour was opened for the main Allied invasion fleet. It was clean, fast, violent, and professional. The Rangers had announced themselves to the world. 4 months later, at El Guettar in Tunisia, Derby led the Rangers on a night march of roughly 12 miles through rugged mountain terrain to hit Italian defenders from behind at the pass of Jebel El Ankh. The approach was brutal. They climbed in darkness over terrain that would have stopped a mountain goat, carrying full combat loads, maintaining absolute silence. When they reached the enemy positions, the Italians never knew what hit them. The Rangers took roughly 200 prisoners and shattered the Italian defensive positions. The 1st Battalion earned its first Presidential Unit citation. Derby received the Distinguished Service Cross. His reputation was set in stone. He was the man who built Rangers and led them from the front, and he would never ask his soldiers to go anywhere he would not go first. On the strength of these victories, the army ordered Derby to form 2 more battalions. The 3rd Ranger Battalion activated on May 21, 1943, under Major Herman Dammer. The 4th Ranger Battalion activated on May 29 under Major Roy Murray. Both trained at Nemours on the Algerian coast, and by summer Derby commanded 3 full Ranger battalions, a brigade-sized force of the finest light infantry in the American military. They would need every man. In Sicily, the Rangers spearheaded the landings at Gela and Licata on July 10, 1943. The beach assault was textbook. The Rangers hit the shore, cleared the coastal defences, and pushed inland before the defenders could organise a response. Then Italian armour counterattacked. Tanks rolled toward the beach at Gela, threatening to push the entire invasion force back into the Mediterranean. Derby did not wait for anti-tank support. He personally grabbed a 37mm anti-tank gun, wheeled it into position on the waterfront, aimed it down the street, and destroyed the approaching tanks himself. It was an act so reckless and so effective that it earned him an oak leaf cluster to his Distinguished Service Cross. After Sicily, General Eisenhower tried to promote Darby to brigadier general. Darby refused. He would not leave his Rangers. He told Eisenhower he would rather command Rangers as a colonel than command a division as a general. He would not trade the 3 battalions of men who trusted him for a star on his shoulder. That decision, the best and the worst he ever made, would define everything that came after. The star would find him eventually. It would arrive too late. After Sicily came Salerno in September 1943, where the Rangers seized and held Chiunzi Pass against repeated German counterattacks on the heights above the beachhead. For weeks they clung to the high ground, fighting off enemy assaults that came day and night. They held the pass. They always held. Then the front crawled north into the frozen mountains of the Italian winter line, San Pietro, Venafro, the icy ridges south of Cassino. This was a completely different kind of war, not raids. Not surprise assaults, not the surgical strike operations Rangers were designed to execute. This was grinding, attritional, static trench warfare against fortified German mountain positions in some of the worst terrain in Europe. Day after day of artillery barrages that shook the mountains. Mortar fire that never stopped, and could not be silenced because the German tubes were dug into reverse slopes where American guns could not reach them. Snipers who picked off exposed men with methodical patience. Freezing rain that turned foxholes into ice baths. Wind that cut through every layer of clothing and drove the temperature below freezing night after night. The Rangers suffered hundreds of casualties during the winter fighting. Many of those losses came not from enemy fire, but from the elements. Cold, rain, trench foot that turned men's feet black and sent them to the hospital. Exhaustion so deep that soldiers fell asleep standing up and had to be shaken awake when their turn came in the rotation. The replacements who filled the empty slots in the ranks had not trained at Achnacarry. They had not crawled under live fire in Scotland. They had not learned the commando methods that made the original Rangers different from every other unit in the army. They were regular soldiers, many of them fresh from the States, dropped into positions alongside veterans who had been fighting since North Africa. The Rangers were being diluted with every casualty and every replacement. Worse, they were being misused. Light raiders do not hold mountain ridgelines for weeks at a time. Commando units are not designed to serve as conventional line infantry in a war of attrition. They are a scalpel, not a shovel. The army either did not understand the difference or did not care. The Rangers bled through the Italian winter while nobody in the chain of command questioned whether this was the right use for the most capable soldiers they had. Then came Anzio. On January 22, 1944, the Allies launched Operation Shingle, an amphibious landing at Anzio and Nettuno, roughly 60 miles behind the German Gustav Line. The concept was audacious. Land a corps behind the enemy, cut their supply lines, force them to abandon the mountain defenses that had stalled the Allied advance for months. The invasion fleet carried the American 3rd Infantry Division under General Lucian Truscott, the British 1st Infantry Division, 3 Ranger battalions, the 509th Parachute Infantry Battalion, British Commandos, tank battalions, and supporting units. They came ashore against almost no resistance. Only 2 German battalions were in the immediate area. By midnight of the first day, 36,000 troops and over 3,000 vehicles were on the beach. Only 13 Americans had been killed. The Rangers seized the port of Anzio itself in a swift, clean operation. It felt like the old days. Speed, surprise, overwhelming force against a weak defender. It was the easiest amphibious landing of the war. The road inland was open. The Alban Hills, the commanding high ground overlooking Rome and the German rear, were within reach. A bold push could have cut the German supply lines and forced a retreat from the Gustav Line. Major General John Lucas, commanding the 6th Corps, had surprise, momentum, and open road ahead of him. He stopped. Lucas consolidated the beachhead. He dug in and waited for more troops, more supplies, and more certainty. His orders from General Mark Clark were deliberately cautious, telling him to advance toward the Alban Hills rather than seize them. Lucas was a pessimist by nature and a cautious commander by training. He believed the landing force was too small for the mission assigned. He feared overextending and being surrounded and destroyed like the British at Arnhem would be 8 months later. So he waited. He built up his supply dumps. He improved his defences. He waited for the enemy to react, and the enemy obliged. While Lucas waited, Field Marshal Albert Kesselring responded with a speed that stunned the Allied High Command. Kesselring was one of the most capable German commanders in the entire war. He had held Italy against superior forces for months through brilliant defensive operations and rapid counterattacks. He recognized the Anzio threat immediately and began rushing reinforcements from across Italy, from southern Germany, and from the Balkans. General Eberhard von Mackensen assembled the newly constituted German 14th Army around the beachhead. The Hermann Goering Panzer Division moved into position. The 3rd Panzer Grenadier Division arrived. The 65th Infantry Division, the 715th Infantry Division. More kept coming every day. By January 29, 1 week after the landing, 71,500 German troops encircled 69,000 Allies. The besiegers had become the besieged. The window of opportunity had not just closed, it had been bricked shut. Winston Churchill wrote to General Harold Alexander with words that became one of the most quoted lines of the war. Churchill's own words became one of the most quoted lines of the war. "I had hoped that we were hurling a wildcat onto the shore," he wrote, "but all we had got was a stranded whale." Lucas needed to break out of the closing ring before it crushed the beachhead entirely. He planned a 2-pronged offensive for January 30th. The British 1st Division would push north up the Via Anziate toward Campoleone. On the right flank, the Rangers would seize Cisterna, cutting Highway 7 and the railroad junction that fed German positions across the sector. The plan was tailor-made for the Rangers' strengths: night infiltration through difficult terrain, surprise seizure of a key objective, speed. The 1st and 3rd Ranger Battalions, 767 men plus a 43-man platoon from the 3rd Reconnaissance Troop, would move through the drainage ditches of the reclaimed Pontine marshes under cover of darkness. They would bypass German outposts silently, reach Cisterna before dawn, and take the town before the defenders could organize resistance. The 4th Ranger Battalion would attack up the road from Conca to link up at first light. The 3rd Battalion of the 15th Infantry Regiment would follow the 4th. The 7th Infantry Regiment and the 504th Parachute Infantry Regiment would support on the flanks. Derby approved the plan. In his own words, the plan was not an unusual one for my Rangers. In fact, it was down our alley, and one that would have delighted the heart of Major Rogers in pre-revolutionary days. But he was troubled by one critical gap. There had been no time to send reconnaissance patrols ahead. The attack was ordered for the same night it was conceived. They were going in blind, relying entirely on intelligence that told them the road to Cisterna was clear. Derby accepted the risk because he trusted his Rangers and trusted the reports he had been given. That trust would cost him everything. The intelligence was catastrophically wrong. What Derby did not know, what nobody on the Allied side knew, was that the Germans had designated Cisterna as the assembly area for reserve divisions massing for a major counterattack against the beachhead, scheduled for February 1st. On the night of January 29, the very night the Rangers began their approach, elements of the Hermann Goering Panzer Division moved into positions in and around Cisterna. The 715th Infantry Division was already entrenched in the area. The 2nd Parachute Training Battalion occupied nearby positions. The town that Allied intelligence described as lightly held by outpost forces was now the centre of one of the heaviest German concentrations on the entire Anzio perimeter. Infantry, tanks, self-propelled guns, anti-aircraft batteries converted for ground fire, artillery pre-registered on every approach route, all of it packed into the exact area the Rangers had been told, was nearly empty. One man tried to prevent the catastrophe. A Polish conscript serving in a German unit deserted to the American lines that night. He was terrified and desperate. He tried to warn the Americans about the build-up at Cisterna. He pointed toward the town. He held up his fingers to indicate numbers. He gestured wildly, trying to mime tanks and artillery and massed infantry. Nobody could understand him. There was no Polish-speaking interpreter available anywhere on the beachhead that night. The deserter was processed through normal channels and evacuated to the rear for questioning. His warning, the one piece of information that could have stopped everything that was about to happen, was never relayed to the Rangers. The 767 were already in the ditches, already moving north through the darkness, already walking toward a wall of German armor and infantry that nobody had told them was there. If you want to know what happened when the sun came up, please like this video. Every like pushes this story to someone who has never heard what happened at Cisterna. 767 men deserve to be remembered. Please subscribe. Back to the ditches. At approximately 0100 hours on January 30, the 1st and 3rd Ranger Battalions crossed the line of departure and entered the Pontine drainage network. Darby remained at the forward command post, an isolated farmhouse just south of the Conca to Cisterna road. From there, he would coordinate the 4th Battalion's supporting attack and maintain radio contact with the infiltrating columns. The entire plan depended on two things: speed and silence. Get to Cisterna before dawn. Take the town before the Germans could react. Hold until the 4th Battalion and the 15th Infantry arrived to reinforce. The night was cold, raw, and dark. The Italian winter had turned the Pontine lowlands into a waterlogged swamp. The air smelled of stagnant water and rotting vegetation. The Rangers moved in single file through ditches barely wide enough for one man carrying a pack. Water rose to their waists in the deeper sections. Ice-cold water that soaked through their uniforms and numbed their legs within minutes. Mud pulled at their boots with every step, trying to suck the shoes right off their feet. They carried M1 Garand rifles, Thompson submachine guns, Browning automatic rifles, grenades, bazookas, sticky mines, and as much ammunition as a man could carry and still move through waist-deep water. No heavy weapons, no mortars of their own, no armor support, no organic artillery. They were light infantry, designed to move fast and hit hard. That was their greatest strength. On this morning it would be their fatal weakness. The column stretched for over a mile through the ditch network. 767 men in a long single-file line, moving through enemy territory in total silence. No one spoke, above a whisper. Hand signals passed from man to man in the darkness. Every sound was a potential death sentence. A rifle stock banging against a canteen, a boot splashing too loudly in the water. A cough that might carry across the flat ground to a German sentry. The Rangers had trained for exactly this kind of movement at Aknakari. They knew how to be invisible in the dark. They bypassed German positions without detection, slipping past sentries who were watching the roads and the obvious approaches, not the drainage ditches that no sane commander would use as an infiltration route. They crossed open ground between ditch sections on their bellies, crawling through mud with their weapons held above the muck, pressing their faces into the cold earth whenever a flare went up or a searchlight swept the horizon. Progress was slow but steady. For hours, everything went according to plan. Then, problems began to multiply. At 02:48, 4 radio operators from the Ranger Force headquarters, who were supposed to accompany the 3rd Battalion, became disoriented in the pitch darkness and turned back. Without them, communications between the forward battalions and Darby's command post became unreliable. Static, broken transmissions, dead air when there should have been acknowledgements. Then the 3rd Battalion lost contact with the 1st Battalion somewhere around the halfway point. The two columns were now moving independently through enemy territory, with degraded communications and no way to coordinate. Major Alva Miller, commanding the 3rd Battalion, recognized the danger. He needed to re-establish contact. He moved out of the ditch and onto the road, where he could get a better radio signal. A German tank was waiting somewhere in the darkness. A single round killed Miller instantly. The 3rd Battalion's commanding officer was dead before the battle began. He was the first Ranger to die at Cisterna, and no one in the ditch around him saw the shot that killed him. Captain Charles Schunstrom pushed forward through the column and took charge of the 1st Battalion's rear companies. He linked up with Major Jack Dobson, who was leading the forward elements. They kept moving. There was nothing else to do. Cisterna was ahead. Dawn was 30 minutes away. Turning back now would mean crossing all that open ground in daylight with German positions on every side. The only way out was through. At first light, the Rangers were approximately 800 yards short of Cisterna. They could see the buildings of the town in the grey morning light. They could see the road. They could see the flat, open farmland between their ditches and the objective. 800 yards of treeless, coverless ground with nothing to hide behind except Italian dirt. They had to cross it. There was no other way to reach the town. The moment they climbed out of the drainage ditches and moved into the open, the trap closed around them like a steel fist. German fire erupted from every direction at once. Machine guns from prepared positions opened up first, their tracers cutting lines across the flat ground. Then rifles. Then mortars, their rounds arcing overhead with that distinctive whistle and crashing down among the exposed rangers with devastating accuracy. Then the tanks. Panzer IVs, at least 17 of them, rolling forward from concealed positions behind farmhouses and hedgerows, their 75mm guns traversing onto the Americans caught in the open. Anti-aircraft guns, mounted on trucks, weapons originally designed to shoot down aircraft, were depressed to fire horizontally into the Rangers at near point-blank range. These flak guns were among the most feared weapons in the German arsenal. They fired explosive shells at a rate that could shred a man into pieces before he heard the report. Artillery, directed from observation posts in the upper floors of buildings in Cisterna, sent shells screaming into the flat ground, where 767 men had absolutely nowhere to hide. The killing zone was total. Fire came from the north, from the east, from the west. Within minutes, from the south as well, as German units that the Rangers had bypassed in the darkness now woke up to the Americans in their rear and opened fire. The Rangers were completely surrounded in open ground with no cover, no concealment, and no way to maneuver. Elements of the 715th Infantry Division, the Hermann Göring Panzer Division, and the 2nd Parachute Training Battalion had them in a 360-degree killing zone. The lightly armed Rangers were facing a force that had tanks, self-propelled guns, and anti-aircraft artillery, dug-in machine gun positions, and pre-registered mortar fire. But the Rangers did not break. They went to ground in the shallow ditches, behind any fold in the earth that offered even inches of protection, and fought back with a fury that startled the Germans. These were the most experienced combat soldiers in the American army. They had been fighting continuously since North Africa. They had been through Arzeu, El Geta, Gela, Salerno, Chiunzi Pass, and the Winter Line. They knew how to fight outnumbered. They knew how to fight surrounded. What they did not know was how to fight tanks with rifles, but they would try. Bazooka teams crawled forward through the mud and the dead to engage German armor at close range. A bazooka round had to be fired from within 50 yards to reliably penetrate a Panzer IV's armor plate. 50 yards from a 30-ton machine that was actively trying to kill you. Rangers crept through ditches, behind the bodies of fallen comrades, through shell craters filling with water, to reach firing positions close enough for the bazooka to work. Some hit their targets. Tanks erupted in flame, their crews scrambling from hatches or burning inside. Others missed, and the tanks swiveled their turrets toward the smoke trail of the rocket and blew the bazooka teams apart with high explosive rounds. Grenades were thrown at armored vehicles from distances measured in feet. Rangers stuck sticky mines to the hulls of tanks that rolled directly over their positions. The technique required a man to lie flat in a ditch, let a 30-ton tank pass over him close enough to touch, then rise up behind it and place the adhesive charge on the rear deck where the armor was thinnest. If the mine stuck, the tank burned. If the mine slipped, the man died. Major Jack Dobson personally knocked out a German tank in a way that would seem like fiction if multiple witnesses had not confirmed every detail. Dobson waited for a Panzer IV to approach his position. When the tank commander exposed himself through the open hatch to direct his driver, Dobson shot him in the head with his service pistol from a distance of roughly 10 yards. Then Dobson climbed onto the moving vehicle, pulled a white phosphorus grenade from his belt, and dropped it through the hatch into the crew compartment. White phosphorus burns at over 800 degrees Celsius. It ignites everything it touches and cannot be extinguished with water. The tank crew died instantly. Dobson jumped clear and continued to command his men until he was wounded too badly to move. 2 German tanks were actually captured by Rangers who killed the crews in hand-to-hand combat, pulling the men out of their hatches and fighting them on the hulls and in the turrets. The Rangers tried to turn the captured tanks against their former owners, but in the smoke and confusion of the battlefield, other Ranger bazooka teams could not identify who was operating the vehicles. They fired on the tanks and destroyed both with rockets. Americans killing Americans. In the chaos, the noise, the smoke, and the terror of a collapsing battlefield, men could not tell friend from enemy inside an armored hull. The Germans brought up more armor, more infantry, more firepower. The Rangers had bazookas, but not enough of them. They had grenades, but grenades cannot stop a tank column at distance. They had rifles and submachine guns and Browning automatic rifles, weapons designed for killing men, not machines. And the machines kept coming. Panzer IVs in groups of 3 and 4, advancing with infantry screening their flanks. Self-propelled artillery pieces firing at Rangers from ranges where the Rangers could not fire back. Flak trucks raking the ditches with rapid-fire cannons that cut men in half. The mathematics were simple and merciless. 767 lightly armed men against a reinforced panzer division. Back at the farmhouse command post, Darby heard every transmission. He knew his Rangers were being destroyed. He ordered the 4th Ranger Battalion to attack immediately, up the Conker to Cisterna Road. Break through the German lines. Reach the 1st and 3rd. Get them out. The 4th Battalion attacked with everything it had. They drove north toward the hamlet of Femina Morta, a name that translated to dead woman, a name that proved prophetic. German tanks, self-propelled guns, and dug-in infantry with pre-registered artillery fire blocked the road completely. The 4th suffered 30 killed and 58 wounded, trying to force the passage. They threw themselves at the German positions again and again. They could not advance another yard. The road to Cisterna was sealed shut. Darby radioed the trapped Rangers. His voice came through the static, desperate and commanding at the same time. He told them to hold on. He told them help was coming. He told them to hang on to the radio until the last minute, to stick together, to use their heads, and to do what was best. He believed the 4th could still break through. He pushed them forward again. They attacked again. They were stopped again. The 15th Infantry was stopped. The 504th Parachute Infantry was stopped. Every supporting attack on the entire front stalled against the same unexpected wall of German strength. Nobody was reaching Cisterna. The Rangers knew it. They could hear the 4th Battalion's attack in the distance to the south. They could hear the intensity of the firing rise, then plateau, then diminish. The relief force was not getting closer. It was getting quieter. The sound of rescue was fading. The 767 were on their own, and they knew it, but they kept fighting. As the morning wore on, the situation in the fields outside Cisterna deteriorated from desperate to impossible. Ammunition ran out first in the forward positions, where the heaviest fighting was concentrated. Rangers fired their last clips and reached for more and found nothing. Then the middle positions went dry, then the rear. Men searched the bodies of the dead and wounded for bullets, for grenades, for anything that could still be loaded or thrown. They checked every pocket. They pried open ammunition pouches on men who no longer needed them. Rangers, who had emptied their own weapons, picked up German Mausers from enemy dead. American soldiers firing German rifles at German soldiers. Men who had nothing left at all threw rocks, not as a gesture of defiance, as a weapon, because a rock was the only thing they had, and a Ranger does not stop fighting because he runs out of bullets. The combat became hand-to-hand in pockets across the battlefield. Americans and Germans grappled in the mud and blood of the Italian lowlands, killing each other with knives, with fists, with helmets used as clubs, with entrenching tools, with anything hard enough to crack a skull. Rangers who had been trained in close combat at Achnacarry used every technique they had learned in those Scottish killing houses. Chokes, throws, knife work. The German soldiers they were fighting were not rear echelon troops. Many were veterans of the Eastern Front. Some were paratroopers from elite airborne units. The fighting was savage and personal in a way that modern warfare rarely produces. Men looked into the eyes of the men they killed. The Germans tightened the ring steadily. More tanks, more infantry. They brought up loudspeakers and broadcast surrender demands in English. They placed captured Rangers in front of their advancing vehicles, using wounded and unarmed Americans as human shields, and drove slowly toward Ranger positions. Some Rangers surrendered because they had nothing left to fight with. Their weapons were empty. Their bodies were broken. Their positions were overrun. Others refused. A medic was reportedly killed because he would not stop treating a wounded Ranger and raise his hands. He knelt beside his patient and kept working, applying a bandage with steady hands while German soldiers stood over him and shouted at him to stop. They shot him where he knelt. Small groups of Rangers held out in isolated positions throughout the morning. In farmhouses, they barricaded doors with furniture and fired through windows until the ammunition was gone. In ditches, they pressed themselves into the mud and waited for Germans to come close enough to grab. In shell craters, 3 or 4 men back to back, sharing their last rounds and counting shots. Each pocket of resistance was reduced one by one. German tanks surrounded buildings where Rangers had taken cover. The tanks fired main gun rounds through the stone walls at point-blank range. Roofs collapsed, floors gave way, walls disintegrated. The Rangers inside fought from the rubble until the rubble buried them. At approximately 12:15, Derby received the final radio transmission from the forward battalions. Every previous communication had carried gunfire in the background, explosions, shouting. The sound of men fighting and dying. This transmission was different. The background was quieter. The fighting was ending, not because the Rangers had won, but because there were almost none left to fight. The voice on the radio belonged to Sergeant Major Robert E. Holt, one of the original Rangers who had been with Derby since Achnacarry. His words were calm, measured, and absolutely devastating. He said some of the fellows were giving up. He said, "Colonel, we are awfully sorry." He said they could not help it because they were running out of ammunition. "But I ain't surrendering," E. Holt said. "They are coming into the building now." Another voice broke through the static, possibly from the same position, possibly from another group of holdouts nearby. "They are closing in, but they will not get us cheap." Then E. Holt's final transmission, the last words anyone would hear from Derby's Rangers. "So long, Colonel. Maybe when it is all over, I will see you again." E. Holt destroyed his radio so the Germans could not use it. German tanks fired into the building where he was holed up. The walls collapsed, the roof caved in, the radio went silent. There was nothing on the frequency but static. Colonel William Derby, the man who had built the Rangers from nothing, who had refused a general's star because he would not leave them, lowered his head onto his arm and wept. His jeep driver, Sergeant Carlo Contrera, watched him break down completely. Contrera said later that Derby put his head down and cried. The man who had built the Rangers heard them die, one crackling radio transmission at a time, sitting in a farmhouse while the men who needed him fought and fell 10 miles away. He could not reach them. He could not save them. He would carry that failure for the rest of his life. It would not be a long life. The silence on the frequency meant the end. The official United States Army history documented the cost. 12 killed in action, 36 wounded, 743 captured. The 4th Ranger Battalion lost an additional 30 killed and 58 wounded in its failed relief attempts. Of the 767 who had infiltrated toward Cisterna, 6 made it back to friendly lines. One of those 6 was Private First Class James Palmer of the 1st Ranger Battalion. Palmer was an orphan from Buffalo, New York, who had enlisted at 17 because he had nothing else and nowhere else to go. An American mortar team found him wandering behind the lines, dazed, disoriented, and barely able to speak. He had somehow slipped through the German encirclement in the confusion of battle. Palmer later described the fighting in plain, soldiers' language. He said it was really tough back there because the Germans were firmly entrenched, and all they could do was watch and try to pick them off as fast as they sighted them. He called the Rangers dirty sons of guns under a great soldier. He meant Derby. He meant every word as the highest praise a combat infantryman could offer. Palmer later returned to combat, was severely wounded by shrapnel, and was sent home. He earned 2 Purple Hearts and a Bronze Star. He rarely spoke about Cisterna for the rest of his life. Captain Charles Schunstrom was among the captured. But Schunstrom was not a man who accepted captivity. He escaped from German custody and spent weeks trekking hundreds of kilometers through the Italian winter. He moved by night through enemy-held territory. He hid by day in barns, in haystacks, in ditches that reminded him of the ones that had brought him to Cisterna. He fought alongside Italian partisans. He crossed no man's land between German and Allied positions and eventually reached friendly forces on the Adriatic coast. He filed a detailed after-action report for Derby months after the battle. Ranger historian Robert Black, who spent decades studying the Ranger battalions, later wrote that there were many brave men in the Rangers, but there were none braver than Charles Merton Schunstrom. The 743 who remained in German hands entered the prisoner of war system. They were stripped of their equipment, marched to collection points, and loaded into cattle cars for the long journey north. Enlisted men were sent to stalags across the Reich, including Stalag 2B at Hammerstein in Pomerania. Captured officers went to Oflag 64 at Subin, in occupied Poland. They endured months of captivity. Hunger that gnawed at their insides every hour of every day, cold that bit through thin blankets and inadequate clothing, forced labor details. The psychological weight of confinement for men who had been trained to move, to attack, to seize objectives. Some were held for over a year before Allied advances liberated the camps in the spring of 1945. When they came home quietly. There were no parades. There was no national recognition. The battle that destroyed them had been overshadowed by Normandy, by the Battle of the Bulge, by Iwo Jima, by the 1,000 other battles that followed January 1944. Most Americans had never heard of Cisterna. Most never would. The army acted swiftly after the disaster. The Ranger Force was disbanded. There was no ceremony. No formal acknowledgement. No colours cased with honour. The surviving Rangers, roughly 400 men, including the cannon company and various support elements who had not been part of the infiltrating force, were transferred to the Canadian-American 1st Special Service Force. The Devil's Brigade, as the Germans called them, desperately needed trained replacements after suffering severe casualties in the mountain fighting before Anzio. The Rangers filled their ranks and fought on under a different flag. Roughly 198 Ranger veterans, who had earned enough active duty time, were rotated home to the United States. The 1st, 3rd, and 4th Ranger Battalions, the original Derby's Rangers, were formally inactivated. The unit that had been the spearhead of every major American operation in the Mediterranean theatre, from the first shots at Arzew to the last transmissions at Cisterna, ceased to exist. The question of responsibility landed immediately and heavily. The Rangers had been sent on a night infiltration through enemy territory without any reconnaissance. They had been aimed directly at the strongest German concentration on the entire Anzio perimeter, and nobody in the intelligence chain had detected it. Allied intelligence had described the Cisterna sector as lightly defended, when in reality it was packed with a panzer division's worth of armour and infantry assembling for a counterattack. A Polish deserter had literally walked into American lines and tried to warn them about the build-up, and no one could understand his language. One man speaking one language that no one on the beachhead could translate, and 743 men paid for it. But the intelligence failure was only the proximate cause. The deeper failure was structural. The Rangers were a light raiding force. They had been designed, trained, and equipped for surprise attacks, night operations, commando-style assaults, and rapid withdrawal. They were never intended to serve as conventional spearhead infantry in a frontal attack against fortified positions supported by tanks and artillery. They carried no weapons that could stop a panzer column. They had no armour of their own. They had no heavy mortars, no anti-tank guns beyond a handful of bazookas, no artillery support once they moved beyond the range of the beachhead guns. Yet that was precisely how they had been employed, not just at Cisterna, but for months before it, in the mountains south of Cassino, at San Pietro, at Venafro. The army had taken the finest surgical instrument in its inventory and used it as a bludgeon until it broke. The official army history stated that the infiltration had apparently been discovered and an ambush prepared. But the most thorough, scholarly examination of the battle, produced at the Army's Command and General Staff College in 2004, reached a different conclusion. The study found no satisfactory evidence that any deliberate ambush was planned or executed by the Germans. The German forces at Cisterna were there to stage for their own offensive, not to trap the Rangers. The destruction of the Ranger battalions resulted from catastrophic intelligence failure, compounded by the systematic misuse of elite light infantry in a role they were never designed to fill. Major General Lucas was relieved of command on February 22, 1944, less than a month after Cisterna. He was replaced by Lucien Truscott, the very officer who had suggested the name Rangers 2 years earlier. The beachhead survived weeks of brutal German counterattacks. The breakout finally came in late May. Cisterna itself was not liberated until May 25, 1944, nearly 4 months after the Rangers bled and died in its fields. When American troops entered the town, they found the evidence of what had happened: shell craters, destroyed equipment, the drainage ditches where the Rangers had crawled in the darkness, the open ground where they had died in the light. Derby did not stop fighting after Cisterna. He could not. He took command of the 179th Infantry Regiment, 45th Infantry Division, and led them through the savage German counterattacks on the Anzio perimeter in February and March of 1944. The Germans threw everything they had at the beachhead, trying to push the Allies back into the sea. Darby commanded infantry in defensive fighting for 6 weeks, holding positions against armor and artillery attacks that made Cisterna look like a skirmish. He served with distinction. He was effective. He was brave. He was also a man carrying a wound that no medic could treat. He had listened to his Rangers die and could not save them. That weight sat on his shoulders every hour of every day. Then the army ordered him back to Washington. Staff duty. The Pentagon. Desk work and memoranda and meetings that meant nothing to a man who had led commandos in combat. Darby spent months in Washington performing the bureaucratic work he had despised since Belfast in 1942. He requested a return to the front repeatedly. Each request was denied or deferred. The army had plans for him. Darby did not care about the army's plans. He wanted to be back with soldiers. He wanted to lead men. He wanted to be at the sharp end again, where decisions mattered and paperwork did not exist. In April 1945, he finally got his wish. He arrived in northern Italy on what was supposed to be an observation tour attached to the headquarters of General Henry Arnold. The war in Europe was in its final weeks. Germany was collapsing. Allied forces were pushing from every direction. When Brigadier General Robinson Duff, the assistant commander of the 10th Mountain Division, was wounded on April 23, Darby replaced him. He led Task Force Darby in the final push through the Italian Alps, driving north along the shores of Lake Garda toward Austria. He was in his element again, leading men, making decisions that saved lives and took ground, moving fast through mountain terrain toward an enemy that was breaking apart. For one brief week, William Darby was what he had always wanted to be, a combat commander leading soldiers in the field. On April 30, 1945, the task force reached the town of Torbole at the northern tip of Lake Garda. Darby was standing among a group of officers near the lakefront, discussing the next phase of the advance. A German 88mm artillery shell, one of the last fired by a collapsing German army, exploded in the middle of the group. The blast killed Darby instantly. He was 34 years old. Sergeant Major John Evans, who had served beside him for years, died with him. 2 days later, on May 2, 1945, all German forces in Italy signed the instrument of surrender. The war in Italy was over. William Orlando Darby missed the end by 48 hours. He was posthumously promoted to Brigadier General on May 15, 1945. He was the only American officer to receive a posthumous promotion to general during the Second World War. The star he had refused in 1942, the rank he had turned down because he would not leave his Rangers, was finally pinned to his name after he was no longer alive to wear it. Darby had stayed with his men instead of accepting promotion. His men were destroyed at Cisterna. Then Darby was killed, 2 days before the guns fell silent. The cruel arithmetic of war does not care about loyalty or sacrifice or love. It simply takes. Darby is buried at Fort Smith National Cemetery in Arkansas, where his remains were reinterred in 1949 after being brought home from Italy. His headstone reads, Brigadier General, the rank he never held while breathing. Cisterna left its mark on both sides of the Atlantic. In the town itself, a road was renamed via Day Rangers. A battle marker was erected for the 50th anniversary in 1994 because the dead of all 3 nations lie in that ground. The people of Cisterna never forgot the Americans who came in the darkness of January 1944 and never went home. Cisterna and Fort Smith, Arkansas, became sister cities, 2 small towns connected forever by a battle that destroyed one town's sons and haunted the other's memory. The local high school in Cisterna was dedicated to Darby. In the United States, the legacy grew slowly but steadily. Darby's name was given to the first phase of Army Ranger School at Fort Benning. Every Ranger candidate who has ever earned the tab passed through Darby phase, named for the man who created the standard they were trying to meet. Camp Darby, near Livorno, Italy, bears his name. A deployment facility at Fort Drum, New York, carries it as well. A bronze statue of Darby riding a 1942 Harley-Davidson motorcycle, sculpted by Kevin Cressay, was unveiled in Cisterna Park in Fort Smith in 2016. He was inducted into the Ranger Hall of Fame in 1992. A distinguished graduate award at Ranger School is named in his honor. Every year, soldiers compete in the Derby Challenge, a 40-mile endurance march along Lake Garda finishing at Torbole, the town where Derby was killed. The modern 75th Ranger Regiment traces its heritage and its identity directly to Derby's force. The motto, "Rangers lead the way," was born from the men who stormed the beaches of North Africa, who climbed the cliffs at Pointe du Hoc, who crawled through the ditches of the Pontine marshes in the darkness. Every ranger who serves today inherits the legacy of the 767 who went into the drainage ditches on the night of January 29, 1944. Every ranger carries the knowledge that their forebears were the best, and the best were destroyed not by a superior enemy, but by a system that failed to understand what it had created. This story does not ask what one brave man can accomplish against impossible odds. That is a different kind of story for a different kind of war. This story asks what happens when the best soldiers a country has are failed by the system that trained them, trusted them with its hardest missions, and then threw them away through negligence. The Rangers at Cisterna fought the Germans to a standstill even when surrounded, even when their ammunition was gone and their weapons were empty. They were not defeated by a superior enemy. They were defeated by their own side's blindness. The 767 were not victims. They were warriors who fought with a ferocity that astonished the enemy. They destroyed tanks with pistols and grenades. They captured armored vehicles in hand-to-hand combat. They held open ground against armor and artillery that should have killed them all in the first 5 minutes. They lasted hours in a killing zone that was designed to destroy them in minutes. And when the end came, Sergeant Major Ehalt did not beg for rescue. He did not curse the men who sent him there. He apologized. He said he was sorry that some of his men had to surrender. Then he said he was not surrendering. Then he said goodbye. Then the building came down around him. The lesson of Cisterna is not about courage. Courage was the one thing the Rangers never lacked, and it was not enough. It could not stop a tank column. It could not replace ammunition that was never going to arrive. It could not compensate for intelligence that sent 767 men into a place they should never have been. The real lesson is about the responsibility that leaders owe to the men they send into danger. The responsibility to know what waits on the other side of the darkness. To give those men the right tools for the mission. To use elite soldiers as the precision instrument they were trained to be, not as a blunt object thrown at the nearest objective regardless of whether the mission matches the capability. That responsibility was betrayed at Cisterna, not by one man, not by one decision, by a pattern of institutional failure that stretched back months before the battle and reached up through every level of the chain of command. And 767 of the finest soldiers America has ever produced paid the full price for failures that were not their own. Cisterna is quiet now. The fields where the Rangers fought and fell have been ploughed and planted for over 80 years. Italian farmers work the same ground where young Americans and young Germans killed each other in the cold January mud of 1944. The drainage ditches still run through the flat Pontine countryside, carrying water through fields that once carried blood. The Via dei Rangers runs through the centre of town. A small stone marker stands near where the fighting was heaviest. It says what needs to be said. Name, date, what happened here. The echoes remain. In the Ranger Creed that every modern Ranger memorizes and recites, in the training that pushes men beyond what they believe they can endure, in the principle, learned at the cost of 767 lives, that elite forces must be employed as elite forces, not as conventional infantry, or they will be destroyed. Cisterna taught the American military that lesson. The price of the lesson was an entire brigade of the best soldiers the country had. And now you know. But most people do not. Most people have never heard the name Derby's Rangers. Most people do not know what happened on the morning of January 30, 1944, in a flat Italian field outside a town that most Americans cannot find on a map. That is where you come in. Hit that like button. Not for us, for them. For the 767 who walked into the darkness and the 6 who walked out. Every like sends this video to someone new, someone who should know what these men did and what was done to them. Hit subscribe, turn on notifications. We dig through military archives, through official records, through after-action reports and prisoner-of-war files to find stories like this one. Stories that were buried under bigger battles and more famous names. Stories that sat in filing cabinets while history moved on. We find them. We tell them. Every week. Drop a comment. Tell us where you are watching from. United States, United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, Germany, Italy. We have viewers on every continent. Every one of you is part of this. Tell us if someone in your family served. Tell us their name. Tell us their unit. This comment section is not just a comment section. It is a formation, and every name matters. Thank you for watching. Thank you for staying until the end. And thank you for making sure that Colonel William Darby and his 767 Rangers are finally heard.